We've already discussed the concept of layers. The next thing that I would like to go over are the different types of layers that you can have in Photoshop. So I have Photoshop open already. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new document. Size doesn't really matter because we're just talking about some of the different aspects in there. We can see down here in the layers window that we have the background layer. And there are a number of ways that we can start creating new layers with some of the different tools that we have available. The first layer type that I want to discuss is the pixel layer. So the pixel layer is pretty much your most basic type of layer in Photoshop. This background is a pixel layer. If I create a new layer here, by default it is a pixel layer. Essentially a pixel layer is just something that you can draw in. If I open like my sunset JPEG here, this is a pixel layer. Basically, if I zoom in far enough, I'm going to get the pixel grid, and that is what that layer is composed of. That layer is composed of a bunch of little dots in a giant grid that when you zoom out far enough, you have an image. Same thing with the green that I painted here with the paintbrush tool. If I zoom in enough, you can start to see the pixels, right? And maybe green is a bad color because it kind of blends in with the pixel grid, but if I use purple, now you can see that pixel grid. So that is a pixel layer. It's just a giant grid full of little dots. The next one that I want to go over are the adjustment layers. We have the adjustment panel here, or at least I have the adjustment panel here, and you should too if you're in the Essentials workspace. If you don't see it, you can go to Essentials or reset Essentials. If you don't want to find it that way, you can go up here to Windows and find it here. So what adjustment layers are, is they are essentially things that change whatever's below it. The pixel layer that I have below isn't necessarily the best way to sort of show what they do, but actually if I go back to my sunset picture and I use some adjustment layers here, it'll be more obvious what they do. So like brightness and contrast, I can change some of these properties, and it puts this on a separate layer above the actual pixel layer, and it's affecting whatever is below in the layers panel. And there's quite a few different ones. There's a lot that you can do with adjustment layers, and I don't want to go into all the details because that really deserves its own video. Each adjustment layer, as you can see, also has this white square next to it. This is not the adjustment layer, this is a mask. And masks can be added onto any layer type, but they come by default with these adjustment layers. Basically what a mask does is wherever it is white in the mask, that is where that layer is actually showing. And if I use like the paintbrush and I have black selected, anywhere that I color will not affect what is below it. There is a lot more that you can do with masks, and there's some really cool things to understand with them, and it also deserves its own video. So that's really all I'm going to discuss with masks at this point. So adjustment layers, pixel layers, and the next one to discuss is type. So if I go over to the type tool here, I can click and I can just start typing. So this is type, right? And if we look down here in the layers panel, we can see it has its own special icon. So this is a type layer. Now right now this looks a little fuzzy because I'm actually at more than 100%. If I zoom out, Command minus on the Mac or Control minus on a PC, now you can see it's nice and crisp. If I resize this type, it will be nice and sharp still because that's how types work, right? It's pulling from a type file that tells it how to render at different sizes. It is essentially a vector type format that re-renders no matter what size you make it. That is not true of this pixel layer here. So if I transform this with Command T and I make it larger, let's make it large enough so it's actually very apparent, even in a video. You can see it's fuzzy. So the type stayed sharp, the pixel layer became fuzzy. when you are making a pixel layer larger, it doesn't have vector data to use to figure out how to resize it. It can't just redraw from the math. It is having to increase the size of the pixel grid, increase how many, let's add some purple, increase how many rows and columns there are in this grid, and then figure out what goes between them. So right now, if we have this little area here, and we want to double the size of it, then you're going to have like 6 little pixels where this edge is. And do you keep the edge thin? Do you make the edge bigger? Like, Photoshop is having to guess, and that doesn't always work out nicely. As I toggle the visibility of these layers here, you can also now differentiate between the purple of the hello and the purple from the layer below, because this layers adjustment here is affecting what is below it in the layers panel. Now when we're in the layers panel over here, we can also make some changes. So like if I right click this type layer, I can tell it to rasterize this layer. This layer is now a pixel layer. It is no longer a text layer. So now if I transform this layer with Command T like I was on the others, and I apply that transformation, we will see that it won't be sharp anymore either, just like when we transformed that paint stroke. So now the edges are fuzzy because it's no longer a vector-based type layer. The next type are shape layers. So in the tools window over here, we have these shapes. And so like I can draw a rectangle. Maybe let's choose a new color. We'll go with red. So I can make shapes like circles or squares or polygons or other stuff. And these are also vector type layers. So if I enlarge this circle, no matter how large I make it, it will stay sharp because it is basically a vector type object. And if I zoom in, it will stay sharp, well, pretty sharp. Even though it is a vector layer, because it isn't Illustrator, it is still rendering things in a pixel grid. Let's maybe go ahead and hide that other one. Just like with the type layer, I can right-click this layer and tell it to rasterize, and that will make it a pixel layer, just like the other one. And now if I transform, this will start to become pixelated as well, just like that type layer. So now it's a little fuzzy. Let's go ahead and undo that. So I was opening this sunset already, right? And I could like grab part of this. Now it's a pretty large file and my other one isn't large, but I could use my marquee selector and I could hit Command C on this background layer and paste it over here. And it is, like I said, really big, so let's transform this down a bit. So pasting this in here, this is now a pixel layer. However, if instead of pasting it, if I instead, let's move this over, if I drag it in, this is not a pixel layer. Right now it's asking me to decide how large I want this image before it actually places it. So I can choose. I'm holding shift to keep the proportions the same. If I let go of shift, it can get a bit wonky. So holding shift, let's say that I want it to be about that same size. Now I chose a specific subset of the other photo, but it's okay. So this little icon here indicates that this is a smart object. So if I transform this layer, this pixel layer, even though I pulled it from this other one and it was huge, when I transformed it and made it smaller, it deleted some of those rows and columns of pixels. So now if I transform it to make it bigger, it doesn't have that data anymore. It's going to have to like guess and make it up. So if I press enter, that's really fuzzy looking, and that's not how it was over here. If I zoom in over here, it is grainy, but it is not fuzzy like this, right? So it lost that data and it just had to guess. However, this smart object layer, if I transform this layer, and let's make it pretty large, I can actually type it up here as well. So is that about the same? Maybe a little bigger. Yeah, I think it's about the same. Pretty close. You can see this one is not fuzzy. It is a little grainy because it was shot at night and the photo itself is a little grainy, but it's not fuzzy. So when it is a smart object, it is still tied to the original image. So it is re-pulling that data each time I resize it. Now, one possible problem, though, is being that it is tied to that file, if I throw that file away, and I save this as, let's just call it temp, and let's close Photoshop, and reopen Photoshop, what happens? What happens if the file is moved? Nothing yet. What happens if I resize it? It still looks okay. So what Photoshop is doing is it's not actually referencing the original file. Instead, if I double click, it has actually created a reference inside of this PSD file itself. And if I make changes to this file here, it does actually affect the other document. So if I hit Command S for save and I press OK, now we have that there. And if I move this down so you can see it, it does affect that. This property may seem weird, but it actually has some really cool applications that we can get into later. There is one more type of layer, and that is the video layers here. Video layers in some ways are sort of interesting, and there can be a lot to go over when it comes to working with video in Photoshop. So those are the different types of layers in Photoshop. In addition, in the Layers panel, we have the section up here that lets us filter by layer types. So if we click this, we see just the pixel layers. If we click this, we see the adjustment layers and the pixel layers. We can turn off pixel layers. Now there's just the adjustment layers. We can turn that off and see just the type layers, which I have none because I rasterized that hello layer. But if I add a new type layer, now we can see it when we filter by type. We also have the shape layers there and the smart object layer there. If you're filtering multiple types, instead of having to click multiple types multiple times, you also have this little button here that lets you turn on and off filtering quickly. Video itself isn't really considered any of the other layer types. When you use these filters, it doesn't show up in any of them, which is sort of interesting. We do have this little icon here. So it sort of reminds me of like a smart object, so I could see it going under there. If you think about the concept of video, you have a series of frames per second, right? Which is essentially like a series of individual pixel layers per second. So I could also see it being considered some sort of complex pixel layer, but it doesn't really go underneath either one. You also have this little search here that gives you other methods to search by, but that's not really within the scope of this video. So there you go, those are the layer types. We'll keep talking about some of the other aspects of layers that you need to know in the next few videos.